people who are Western and have not absorbed critical theory find this perplexing because their mental furniture is such that their brain works on reason and works on evidence. And sometimes what happens is they come forward to object to some kind of proposition that's being pushed by the woke and say, well, but that's not true because here's the data. I can show you that what you said isn't true. And what you've just done is not disprove the theory. It's show that you are Western and wrong. You have outed yourself as privileged. By relying on reason and data, you have shown yourself to be the Western bad guy that they are trying to get rid of.
What is woke, and where did it come from? Why are we seeing it spread across our culture and society and trickle into almost every part of our lives? What are the philosophical origins of what some call the woke virus of the mind? Joining me on Liberty Curious to talk about all of these things is Bruce Pardy, a professor of law and executive director of Rights Probe, a law and liberty think tank. He's a classically liberal legal academic who believes in equal treatment under the law, negative rights, private property, limited government, and the separation of powers, which are foundational to the Western legal tradition. All of the things that people wonder, what is making up this madness? Basically, what is woke all about?
What is going on?
What is going on? Yeah, so there's actually some
Right.
kind of method to this madness that we see in our culture and in our institutions. And there are names for these things. And so you have written this chapter for a new book which talks about what you call 4 doctrines of the apocalypse.
Right.
So what are these 4 doctrines of the apocalypse called?
The 4 doctrines are critical theory, postmodernism, critical race theory, and critical social justice. And critical theory is the place that it all begins. Really, critical theory was like a philosophical school of thought that became an academic discipline. It started essentially between the 2 world wars in Germany, when a bunch of scholars were investigating, I guess, why Marxism hadn't caught on in the West. And the critical theory, some people describe it as a neo-Marxist theory, and I agree with that. Now, some of its practitioners wouldn't agree with that because they ditched Marx, or at least they ditched Marx's focus on economic power struggles between upper class and lower class, the capitalists and the workers. But in place of that power struggle, they inserted what came to be, over the course of time, identity politics. And so the basic proposition, I think, is still in common with Marxism, which is that Western society is based upon a power struggle. There's power in everything. And Marx focused on the economic relationship between the upper and lower class, but the critical theorists broadened it from economics into if I can use the word, a holistic investigation, and focused on all kinds of power relationships, including your identity conflicts. At least that's what it's become. And from that time, it migrated from its original origins at the Frankfurt School in Germany to academia in the United States, and then over the course of decades, basically infiltrated all the various disciplines or subjects inside the university. All the sociology and linguistics and the like, psychology. It touched the professional schools, teachers' colleges, law schools, and is now sort of completing its final mission in the hard subjects, that's, science, engineering, medicine, and so on. It has touched everything. And if you are in the academy today and you're paying attention, you will see that the premises of critical theory appear everywhere. And that brings me to two of the other doctrines, critical race theory and critical social justice, which are essentially offshoots in a way. Critical race theory emerged in the late past century in the American Legal Academy. And critical social justice, the term social justice has been around forever to describe various things, but the critical social justice is basically the enterprise of identifying, what might be described as a power pyramid, where you have the straight white males on the top, and then all the other victimized groups below that in ascending order of victimhood. And the project of social justice essentially is to invert that triangle. And so the focus on critical race theory, as the name suggests, is on race, and particularly in the United States, the premise of critical race theory is that American society is basically founded on a power struggle between races, and in particular, white and black.
Right.
Whereas social justice is a bit broader and encompasses all of the various identities one might have, and includes the idea of intersectionality,
Yes.
which I'm sure many viewers have heard
Yes.
about. So those are those three. So if you think of critical theory itself as an umbrella, where all these other things, and it's not just these. I mean, there are others as well, other critical theories that fit under this umbrella, and it's an academic discipline that's really quite messy. So encapsulating it is difficult, and whenever you say something about it that's definite, somebody's going to object, because that's not consistent with this branch or this version or this scholar, and that's all true, but that's also part of its appeal. It's a moving target. You can't quite pin it down to decide what it means, and it can mean different things to different people, and so on. So in the chapter, I use the trying to staple jelly to
Yes.
a wall metaphor. But it's also important to at least try to get a handle on it, because it's having a huge effect. Now, before we go on, let me just refer to the fourth doctrine, which is postmodernism, which is not quite like the other three. It's not a direct descendant of critical theory. It's its own thing. But the two of them have an interesting relationship. Postmodernism, whereas critical theory is basically an anti-Western set of premises. It's wrong to call it a theory, especially now. It's not. I don't know if it ever was, but it's no longer a theory. It's an agenda. It's kind of objectives. It's a plan, I suppose, if you want to put it that way. And its plan is to undermine evil Western institutions and replace them with something else. And so it's critical in the sense that it's not critical in the critical thinking sense. People sometimes hear critical theory and think critical thinking, and that doesn't sound so bad. Critical thinking is not so bad. It's great. It's what we're supposed to be teaching our kids to learn in universities and so on. Critical theory is not critical thinking. Critical theory is an agenda with a set of premises. And critical thinking about critical theory is not the idea. If you go into a classroom with a like, and you start to critically think about critical theory, you might get into trouble, because the idea is that you accept the premises and then act upon them. And that's why some people are canceled, because they are challenging the premises of critical theory.
Right. So before you go on, I just want to kind of paint a picture like for our audience. So basically what this looks like is all of the social justice stuff, the gender ideology, the power relationships, the cisgender old white male, you are owed something because you are born of a certain skin color compared to this person. And if you add all of these different points, these intersectional points, you might be worse off. It's basically based around a kind of victim culture, or it's created a kind of victim culture, rather.
All those things are true, but it might be helpful if I try to describe the core of the proposition. The core of the proposition is this anti-Western stance. So if you think of Western civilization as, at least in part, emerging out of the Enlightenment, where you get the ascendant of reason and the scientific method, We investigate the world through our senses. We try experiments. We take measurements. We collect data. And then we say, here's what I discovered. And then the next person tries to repeat the experiment. And we move away from mysticism and other kinds of beliefs into frankly, a more secular world where facts are measured. It's a world of data and reason and so on. And critical theory is an anti-Western ideology that rejects those basic tenets. And people who are Western and have not absorbed critical theory find this perplexing because their mental furniture is such that their brain works on reason and works on evidence. And sometimes what happens is they come forward to object to some kind of proposition that's being pushed by the woke and say, well, but that's not true because here's the data. I can show you that what you said isn't true. And what you've just done is not disprove the theory. It's show that you are Western and wrong. You have outed yourself as privileged. By relying on reason and data, you have shown yourself to be the Western bad guy that they are trying to get rid of. So critical theory is based, among other things, upon emotion and subjective perception. And that's where postmodernism comes in. Postmodernism is that theory that says that truth is subjective, that truth is socially contingent. Now, there's something to be said for this.
I know we've discussed this quite a lot. We've had late, long conversations about this topic. So tell us, yeah.
Yeah. So it's hard. I mean, there's lots to object to in critical theory and social justice. I mean, there's lots to object to, but the idea of postmodernism has some validity, in my opinion, because even if you are taking a scientific approach to things, you are relying still upon a premise. And the premise is that what you are perceiving through your senses is, in fact, the real world. And there's no way for you to prove that without using your senses again, which doesn't prove it at all. So if people think, well, I saw it happen. I saw the hammer fall to the earth. And so I know it fell to the earth. And you know what? It probably did. But your eyes are not a window. They are lenses through which you interpret the world. And you get feedback from the world into your brain, and the brain makes sense of them. So what you saw probably is true, but you can't prove it. But even more importantly, postmodernism applies, and science does not apply, not to questions not of fact, but of morality. And I've had this argument with a whole lot of people who insist that their morality is the right one. And that's a fruitless argument because morality is not the kind of thing that you can prove. It's just not that kind of a question. And people's morality is different. And the moral proposition is that something is inherently good or bad without regard to the opinions of human beings. So your opinion about morality is irrelevant to whether or not something is actually moral, and nobody can prove that. So there is, for me, some validity to the postmodernist stance. Here's the rub. It would all be very well if that's where they finished. Because if you took that proposition and stuck with it, then in my view, where it ought to lead to is libertarianism. Because you've just said, look, everybody's truth is depends upon their own perceptions. So we have to leave people alone to decide the truth for themselves. I mean, nothing wrong with that proposition. But in this sort of uneasy partnership between postmodernism and critical theory, that's not where they go. The critical theorists have taken this proposition to deconstruct the truths that Western civilization appears to be based on by saying, well, your truth isn't true, truth is relative, so on and so forth. But then they go on and say, oh, and by the way, that man is a woman. And if you say otherwise, you're wrong. Well, okay, so hold on. You just said that truth was relative, that truth was a matter of social construction. What if my truth is that that man is still a man? So that kind of relative truth is not allowed. So here we get to the incoherence of critical theory, and incoherence is critical theory's middle name. Postmodernism is being used for a purpose, but the kind of insanity that you're seeing, in my opinion, is not first and foremost a postmodernist insanity. It's a critical theory insanity that is leaning on postmodernism when it wants to.
Okay. So postmodernism then. So if we can just kind of sum up what that means briefly, just alone, like if you stripped away critical theory from it, what does it mean purely?
That truth is socially contingent. So it's a challenge to all those people who say that there is objective truth, and especially moral objective truth.
Got it.
If you're one of those people who says, look, this is moral, this is not, this is the way we do things, the postmodernists say, prove it. And you can't.
This makes sense. And this is a hard pill to swallow because, some people think, well, there are certain things that are objectively moral, like what about the 10 Commandments back in the day? That might have been some kind of, you could have perceived that as an objective morality. It was like a moral code that everybody was supposed to adhere to, right? So like maybe there's something in postmodernism becoming ascendant where you've kind of lost that moral religious code, and that has left a void for something like postmodernism and then critical theory to spring.
Oh, no question. No question. And also for something like trans-humanism to spring. For sure. But that doesn't change the reality, if you like, of the difficulty of establishing moral truths. So sometimes I say this to people. I say, all right, so think of a proposition that seems to you to be clearly moral. I mean, think of the worst thing you can possibly think of as an immoral act. A thing that, 99% of people that you know would agree with. And then prove it. And then prove it's immoral. You can't. It's not the kind of thing it is. And so when you insist upon a certain moral truth being accepted as true, you're now no longer dealing in morality itself, but with consensus. You're saying, well, everybody agrees that so-and-so is true. So therefore, it is. No. The moral proposition is not about consensus. Let's turn it around. If you had a society in which doing awful things to other people was largely regarded as fine, slavery, say. If you go back in time, in many societies, slavery was common and accepted and regarded as moral. Does that mean that it is moral? I would say no. But that illustrates the separation of the morality question from the question about whether people agree with it. Those two things are different.
Okay. Because when you were saying, think of an example of things that people consider now morally acceptable, I was thinking exactly what postmodernism plus critical theory leads to, which is all of the woke culture, right? So many people agree that this is a good thing, and it's morally good to sterilize children, to give them hormones, to block their puberty, and to do other things that are worse than that.
Right. So if we, and I don't think it's a consensus, but let's say you took a poll, and over half the people that you polled said that they were okay with that. They thought that was moral. Does that mean that it is? I would say no. But then on the other hand, you can't prove that it's not either. So, you know, morality for me is something that you leave to individuals to decide. And hopefully we get a close enough to agreement or consensus that we can all get along with each other. But as soon as you get one moral view being imposed in the law on the grounds that it's the one moral right way, now you're in danger of having tyranny because somebody's view is being imposed upon other people who are not required to agree.
Can you give some examples of things that you see right now and in the past few years where that has been so, where the law has been wielded in that way?
Oh, sure. Well, there are sometimes there are crimes, criminal offenses on the books that are sometimes referred to as morality offenses, and they're called that because they're victimless. So if you think of prostitution, for example, which is no longer a crime, but it was, you have a transaction between a prostitute and a John, and they obviously both want the transaction or they wouldn't enter into it. So there's no other victim other than the people who don't like it, like the idea of it. So it's a morality offense. The two of you together are not allowed to do this because it's wrong. Or also restrictions on recreational drugs, sometimes justified because the use of drugs is immoral. Also because of the bad consequences, which perhaps are also immoral but also costly. But in all of these cases, the justification is not the same as for other kinds of offenses where you are committing an act of violence, for example, against somebody else. When you're doing that, you are using force against your neighbor. You're interfering with them. You are intruding upon their liberty to do as they think is right. So those are like two different categories, for me anyway, of offenses.
And if we talk about not just those kinds of offenses, but things that we've seen play out, like let's say with COVID restrictions and things like that, that are operating more at the state level, where there is a kind of morality that's being imposed upon the citizens by the state. Can you talk a little bit about that, and how does that get mixed up with critical theory?
Right. So this this gets mixed up in a lot of things. With critical theory, also gets mixed up with the existence and operation of our overbearing administrative state. Right. So the COVID response was thoroughly collectivist.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So if you are walking around outside on the sidewalk, you are interfering with no one. Yeah, you might or you might not have COVID, but it has never been a proposition that the fact that you might have some kind of virus and that virus might go into the air has never been a justification for saying you're not allowed to go outside and walk on the sidewalk. I mean, if it was, imagine the kinds of restrictions we would already have been under. Colds and the flu and so on. People would have been sued or charged. Every time somebody else caught the flu, that flu has come from someone else. And it never has occurred to us to think, well, that's because you have, number one, committed a crime, and number two, you're acting immorally. No. We're now in new territory here. And its links to both critical theory and the administrative state, I think, go like this. It is a collectivist view. It includes an agenda to, number one, undermine normal life. It consists of restrictions that in a previous period would never have been dreamed of. The idea that some kind of official should be able to come along and tell you you can't leave your home, or you have to close your business, or you can't go to university, or you can't walk through the park. It's extraordinary. It's actually not Western. But on the basis of this supposed pandemic, you have the government wielding powers that essentially help to erode the Western ideal. And for its part, the administrative state is more than happy to go along because that's what it thinks it exists for. It exists to manage society. And here was the chance. The I mean, its performance during COVID, although by any objective means, if you actually go to the data, like I was referring to before, if you use data and reason to assess what they did, it was an abysmal failure. But that's not what we're doing. Instead, for them, the criteria will be, well, did we manage to manage? And the answer is, well, absolutely yes. I would think that through the eyes of the administrative state and all its people, the COVID crisis was an absolute smashing success, beyond our wildest dreams.
And so when you say that the response was anti-Western, that's really interesting because I was watching the whole thing unfold, and we saw that there was a lot of propaganda coming out of China to guide those lockdowns and other measures. But could we reiterate for a second what Western is? Like, do we know anymore? Do we really know? Like, why was it anti-Western? Was it because people lost their individual rights? They lost their freedom of choice when it came to things being put in their body? What was it that was so anti-Western at the core?
Right. So if you like, the crowning achievement of Western civilization has been the idea of individual autonomy, the ability to decide things for yourself, along with the other kinds of things we've been talking about, reason and data, democracy to a certain extent, and so on. But these things all go together: free speech, open inquiry, et cetera, et cetera. But you need all those things to come together in order to produce a society in which the idea of the individual having control of his own life comes to the fore. And I mean, these kinds of societies are quite rare. If you look at the full landscape of human history, doesn't happen very often. And so those people who are thinking, well, that situation that we had is the normal situation. In COVID, things got weird. Don't worry, it's a pendulum. It's going to swing back to normal. I mean, maybe. I hope they're right. But the other possibility is that period of Western civilization where you had the idea of individual autonomy, and by the way, it was never pure or absolute. I mean, there were always things that encroached upon it, but it was always this struggle to protect it from the inclinations of various interests to impede it. But this period of individual autonomy may have been the aberration itself. And maybe going back to it will be difficult. Now, I don't mean to say that we've lost it altogether. We haven't. I mean, you and I are having this conversation without interference so far. And so there's still lots of it left. But the way things are proceeding suggests that its future is not bright unless we all change our minds about how the society is supposed to be run, unless we decline to embrace critical theory and all of its branches, unless we challenge the authority of the experts who populate the administrative state, who think that it is their job to tell us all what to do in our own interest and in the interests of society. That's, if you like, the central proposition of the administrative state, and that dovetails very nicely with critical theory, right? Because they might not be the same thing, but they are essentially now, in ideas terms, working together along the same path.
Yes. The administrative state is pushing those kinds of ideas that proponents of critical theory are kind of bringing up. So my question then is, critical theory coming out of, you have the Enlightenment, you have Western culture, you have rationality, you have scientific process, you have scientific progress, you have all of these things. And then we see, the First World War, and then you have critical theory and all of these kinds of doctrines. Marxism pops up slightly before the First World War. What happened there in the 20th century? that suddenly it was like the West started to commit suicide. And now
Yes.
we are, we thought, okay, it's over. Now, Second World War is won. We are victorious. We are free again. And we fought for our freedom and we're back there. And now how do we get back here?
Right. It's a very good question, and there are lots of theories about this. And here are two that are sort of in opposition to each other, in very simple terms. And I'm going to oversimplify perhaps a little bit, but in simple terms, one of the theories goes like this: that we had very sound ideas, and we got away from them, and we need to go back
Mm-hmm.
to them. And the other theory goes, no, the seeds of our destruction are in the premises themselves, and that this is just the logical result of those ideas over a period of time.
In which premises?
In the premises of modern Western civilization. So here let me describe that theory for a
Yep.
moment. This is how we get to transhumanism.
Okay.
Okay, so if we're going to identify Western civilization with the Enlightenment, and that's not the only thing that it's connected to, but let's just deal with that for now. Enlightenment, scientific method, and so on. It is a secularization, if you like, of society. It is the death of God. It is the death of mysticism, of spirituality. It's looking at the world in material ways. It is deconstructing the world into its component bits. That's the scientific method. You take things apart to see what they're made of. Material is constructed with atoms, which are built on protons and electrons, and so on. It's a reductionist point of view. Now, there's no particular reason why that endeavor can't coexist with spirituality and religion. But this period also seems to be characterized by a widespread loss of faith on the part of many people. Why some writers people will be familiar with, call it the death of God. Now, if you lose that aspect of your life and you have no faith in anything else but the material, then one thing that you are likely to lose is a sense of meaning, or a sense of belonging, if you like, a sense of well-being, a loss of the sense that the universe is unfolding as it should. A faith in nature, if you like.
And a moral
And
code.
if you and a moral code. And a moral code. I give you that. Absolutely. A moral code. There is meaning in people's moral
Yeah.
codes, right? But so if you lose that, and the world is only material, and there is no heaven to go to, and you are just a collection of molecules, and yet you are predisposed evolutionarily to look for meaning, which humans do, then where are you going to get to? You're going to get to, arguably, some people have made this argument, you're going to get to transhumanism. And transhumanism, people think of transhumanism as the idea of melding, molding, combining human and technology in a way that benefits the human experience. You live longer, your parts are enhanced, you're able to link to the web without going on your computer, all kinds of great benefits to using technology and integrating technology into the human animal. Okay, but what also comes with it is a resolve to reject the world you were born into as essentially wrong and devoid of meaning, and you try to remake it in your own image to make it better, if you like, to try and make heaven on earth, because there is no heaven. It is taking things into your own hands and rejecting the idea that there is any kind of sensibility or direction or value in what was or what is in the natural world even. And instead, there's no problem with making this up for ourselves because there is nothing else. It's okay. So here's where we get to. Here's how it becomes concrete, right? Number one example, I think, is transgenderism, right? So it's consistent with a transhumanist point of view that, well, why can't you change your gender? Because this is all there is. So, and we can do it. We have the technology. We're just going, hey, you say he was born a boy. Well, what does that mean? I mean, that doesn't mean anything. I mean, there is no God. There is no nature that's valuable. What do we care how he was born?
Truth is subjective.
We are going to, here's a subjective. We are going to make a girl. And if you oppose that because he's really a boy, then you just don't get it. And your objection to the procedure is not just an objection to the procedure, it's an objection to the premise of our philosophy. And therefore you are dangerous.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that there's something in there definitely to explore. I've seen the Oxford has this Transhumanist Institute, and one of the scholars who's a leading scholar in that institute, I think it's called the Institute for the Future of Humanity, I'll have to check, wrote something about how we are either it was erasing and or becoming God, but it was something along those lines. So
Right.
it was like
Right.
we are
Right.
becoming God now. It's
Yes.
ascending above the old world, right? But just kind of a side note here about the Western world. So you're saying the
Right.
Enlightenment, part of that was the separation away from God and from religion, which I do see that.
This is the theory. This is the theory. I'm not necessarily
Right.
endorsing it, but there's something to be said for it.
But
Yeah.
but was Western civilization not as well built upon the backbones of
Yeah.
Christianity?
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. No question. But it is this tension, right? There's a tension between that foundation and the materialist, enlightened, scientific
Right.
approach to things. And as I said, there's no particular reason why those two things can't coexist. I mean, you can be a scientist who has religious faith. I mean, lots of people do.
Yeah.
But as a society, we've tended to become secular.
Right. But it
And
it does
yeah.
make sense, though, in some ways that it's less compatible, because once you have the scientific process that develops and you start to really take everything apart and deconstruct it, really, funnily enough, kind of like in critical theory, you're deconstructing at the same time. You're trying to figure out what it is. You might say, how can I prove that there is a God now? That's when that question
Right.
starts to take shape and form in people's minds and in the collective mind, really, right? So that's something that you could
Right.
see happening.
Right. Right. But see, this is interesting. This is where all the threads start to get all confused, right? So if one of the Western characteristics we're talking about is individual autonomy, then you would think that one of the things that ought to be possible is for individuals to have the space and the peace to have and pursue their own faith, their own spirituality, their own beliefs, without them being crushed or rejected as wrong, quote wrong, by an overbearing collectivity. You'd think that in a Western society that values individual autonomy, that the individual would have the space and the peace to be able to have and to pursue his or her own beliefs, own spirituality, own religion. And yet what we're getting is a collectivist kind of rejection of those kinds of belief systems. So you have tangles here, right? You say on the one hand, well, this is maybe the consequence of Western civilization, but on the other hand, there are other things within the Western experience that fight against the inclinations that are in process now. So, it gets to be a mess. I don't think there's any straight lines here, but it's just not straightforward.
So while we're kind of still on the topic of religion or theology and looking at the whole big picture from afar, if you really zone in on kind of woke progressivism, critical theory, couldn't you say that it's starting to take shape as its own religion? And in fact, that religion is also being sponsored by the administrative state, and religion and state are supposed to be separate. So there's maybe some problems that could arise from that. Maybe look at the first half of that first. Do you think that it's becoming a religion?
Well, it certainly has the characteristics of one. So we referred a few moments ago to that human inclination to seek meaning. And, religion is one of the consequences of that programming, if I can put it that way. And so it makes sense that in a world in which people are not religious, that they would seek meaning in a religious way that's
The
secular.
God-shaped hole, they call it.
The God-shaped
Yeah.
hole is what they're trying to fill. I mean, that's one way to put it. And so this also leads to the trans-humanist inclination, right? To be God and to make the world in your own image as its God. That provides you with meaning, I suppose. But on the separation of church and state, I mean, sure, but I don't think that argument's going to work in a courtroom, because it doesn't have those other characteristics that courts are used to looking for in religions, which is a belief in some kind of a God. That's the one thing it's missing. So it has all these other characteristics, adherence to a code, a group, identifiable group, and so on and so forth.
I see.
But I'm not sure it's going to fit the description for other reasons.
Okay, so who do you think, just in your opinion, who do you think the God would be in that religion? Who do you think people would point to as the God?
Well, see, that's a very interesting question. It's not going to be a particular figure. It's going to be an idea, and the idea is the idea of the ideology itself, the idea of victimhood, the idea of the power struggle, the idea, if you want to make this connection between critical theory and the transhumanist impulse, then the God becomes you. The God becomes the human group. It's not just transgenderism. I mean, there's a whole lot of examples of how this is coming to the fore. Another example: there's lots of proposals floating around out there, apparently, about engineering the climate. Seeding clouds or blocking the sun or doing other things. I mean, really, you are going to take the climate into your own hands. You are so wise and so knowledgeable that you're going to mess with the Earth climate system. That shows a profound lack of value and faith in what exists and what was provided.
And
naturally.
a hubris. So as you said, it's the God. The God is
Absolutely.
you. The God is the self. That totally
Yes.
makes sense if you look at it that way. And that was what I had in my head as I was asking you that question. So I think that that's what it is. And it's but it's interesting as well, because in the whole paradigm of the victim mentality, it's almost like as if that is a way to kind of flip that triangle again, to say, I have been victimized by all of these things throughout my life, and the only way for me to push through that is for me to become God.
Sure. And at the top of the pyramid.
Right.
Sure. Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Right. Wow, really interesting stuff here, Bruce. So, okay. So, how did all of these ideas come out of academia? How did they get into the mainstream culture? What happened?
There's an old joke, sometimes attributed to Henry Kissinger, but also to several other people. And so who knows exactly who said it first. But the joke goes, university politics is so vicious precisely because there's so little at stake. Now, that's funny if it's true. And for a long time, it appeared to be true. All these crazy academics arguing about this and that, getting into conflict, and it doesn't really matter. It's like counting angels in the head of a pin. It doesn't make a difference to the real world. That turns out to be wrong. And these things escaped and are embedded into generations of graduates now who are running the show. They're running the government, they're running the media, they're running corporations, they're in HR departments, they're certainly at universities still, new generations of scholars, and they're in public schools. They have taken over. And they think this is the way things are supposed to work.
So you think that that's how it escaped? It's that basically all of these people moved into the workforce. But I mean, that could have been true before as well. Like there have always been kind of quirky ideas in academia that never really made it outside of the walls. Like, could there not be other factors in there as well?
Oh, there are definitely other factors. No question about it. No question about it. There are lots of other things going on as well. I mean, so here's another one. And this is not a critical theory thing, I don't think. I mean, I'm not a scholar in these areas, just to be clear. Um, but another part of the blame I would lay at the feet of feminism, which I don't regard as an offshoot of critical theory. The first wave feminism, or the initial proposition of feminism, was that that women essentially should be entitled to the same rights as men. If you want to put it that simply, again, that might be oversimplification, and some feminist critical scholars might not agree with that. But let's just start with that. I mean, that's a if you like, a classical liberal notion that we are treated equally under
Yeah.
the law. So no problem with that. But it's in the next stage of the feminist proposition that things become problematic. In that stage, and I don't know this well enough to tell you exactly what stage this is, but at a certain point, there's this proposition that we, women, are equal and we are special. So we get equal rights, but we also get special treatment.
Right.
Right? We get all the trappings of being just a man, or just a person. And we get to vote, and we get to own property, and to get to divorce, and all that, of course. But also, we need to be taken care of. We get affirmative action. We need this, we need that, we need our own spaces. We need our own spaces, but we also get to be led into your spaces. And I mean, and I'm starting to say, with respect to the transgenderism about feminism, I'm starting to say, look, you know what, you are reaping what you sowed. You insisted upon women's spaces and open spaces, and now your spaces are being invaded by men.
It's come full circle.
And what did you
It's
expect?
come full
What
circle.
did you
Yeah,
expect?
yeah, no, I mean, I totally see that as well. You could see how all of these things have kind of developed slowly over time, right? And it started with those kinds of movements that were supposed to be, as you said, equal treatment under the law. But then they've kind of just morphed into, maybe it's because they've merged with that kind of intersectional thinking, right? Where it's saying like,
Yeah.
I need a privileged treatment,
Absolutely.
and
Yeah.
that's where it started to kind of go off the rails.
Well, feminism may not have originated with critical theory, but certainly it has dovetailed since then because that's part of the social justice hierarchy, right?
Yes.
Uh, but increasingly being overshadowed by other kinds of identity politics and intersectionality. So if today, according to sort of modern social justice theory and critical race theory, if you are a white woman, a straight white woman, a straight white Christian woman, well, come on, you're not really a victim anymore. You're a victim compared to the straight white Christian men, but that's as far as you're going to get.
Yes, no, I totally see that. It's funny because what's happening here, and you see that as well with gay people, with gay rights, and it started this way, and now with this
Yeah.
whole trans theory that has taken over, that's now pushing out the women and pushing out gay people as well. So it's
Yeah. Right.
kind of come to a point now where it's like devoured itself. You know, something that was supposed to start out as equality has now just morphed into something that has just come and devoured all the premises of those things and turned into something that I can only describe as really kind of inverted and upside down. And if I judge it morally too, that's how I see it. I see it as like, to me personally, it's like these inverted moral principles. And I know that we're
Right.
talking about morality being subjective, but I think that a lot of people, you know, there is some kind of consensus as well as people who look at all of these things happening and they think, what's going on? What has happened? Why are things looking so perverted and abysmal?
Yes, and so back to the feminism, and it doesn't just apply to the feminism. I think a lot of trouble comes from incoherence, and if you trace that basic incoherence that I mentioned, the equal but special, which is asking for equal treatment, but at the same time not equal treatment. That doesn't make any sense.
So this actually kind of ties into, Bruce, what you were talking about in your chapter of this new book, where you talk about undermining individualism and equality in the law. And so you tie
Right.
this in with critical theory. So equal treatment under the law means that everyone is subject to the same rules and standards. When justice is blind, the law treats people as individuals rather than as members of groups, without regard to personal characteristics and regardless of disparate outcomes that equal treatment under the law produces. It applies in the same way to rich and poor, black and white, man and woman, straight and gay. But to critical race theory proponents, social justice advocates, and increasingly lawyers and courts, equality of treatment, also known as formal equality or equality of application, is unjust. Instead, they say legal equality should mean that identity groups should be equal in outcome, and that different rules and standards should be applied to different groups to achieve this result.
Right.
So that ties in with
Yes.
feminism, it ties in with transgender theory. It ties in with all of these things that we're seeing now, and depending where you lie in the power hierarchy, you should be treated differently by the law, basically.
Yes. 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 Oh, should I tell the story of a recent Supreme Court of Canada case that does it this way
Yeah,
to make the point?
absolutely.
We've been talking about feminism, so I believe it's 2019. I could have that wrong, but anyway, a fairly recent decision, maybe 2020, of the Supreme Court of Canada, dealing with a program of the RCMP. Now, the RCMP, of course, is part of government, so it's subject to the Charter. We have a section in the Charter, Section 15, that guarantees equality. Now, the first part of that section appears, at least through my eyes, but it's language, so people give different interpretations to the words. But it certainly seems to me to guarantee equal application, equal treatment of under the law. So this is the idea that the same rules and standards should be applied to everyone. That's not the way the Supreme Court over time has interpreted it. And in this case that I'm talking about, the RCMP created a program whereby its members could decide, if they wanted to work part-time instead of full-time. And the program was open to anybody who wanted it. It was voluntary. And along with that part-time program, they provided a pension program based upon the same proposition as the full-time pension program, which was that your pension will reflect the hours that you've worked over your career. So here's what we have. We have a program by a government agency that applies equally to everybody. It's voluntary and it's logical. Here's what happened. More women than men chose to enroll in the program. And as a result, more women had lower pensions than some of the men. And on that basis, its constitutionality was challenged under Section 15 of the Charter.
Wow.
And the court said, can't have this. These are disparate outcomes between men and women. This is discrimination. Having equal rules apply to both sexes, look at the results. We can't have this. This is a breach of the Charter of Rights.
So they were looking for equality of outcome rather than equality of opportunity.
Yep. Correct.
So is that a good way to sum up critical theory in a sense? Is that it's looking for equality of outcome that you can never attain?
Well, the last part is a very interesting one, and that maybe it will be true, but that might actually be giving critical theory too much credit. So I think the Supreme Court of Canada would endorse that and probably would say they're working towards that outcome. But critical theory, may be more sinister than that. If you agree with the proposition that its origins are such that what it really is after is a deconstruction of Western civilization, and it doesn't really have anything to put in its place. It just wants the place to burn, and it will never be satisfied. I mean, whether or not it was actually working towards something concrete or not, those things always change, and so it's never enough. And that serves the program, because if it's never enough, then you can carry on doing whatever it is destructive that you're doing.
So you wrote something interesting in your chapter as well about how critical theory basically looked like it came from Marxism, when Marxism, they were like, oh, well, this isn't really working out, so we have to kind of find some other other kind of form, some derivative of Marxism, if you like. So
Right.
in that sense, is that the purpose is basically just to destroy and that's it? Like there's nothing else thought of after that? There's no replacement?
Well, so here we get into the question of what the utopia is. And so what you say about Marx, I may have alluded to it earlier, but this is one reason why some people refer to critical theory as neo-Marxist. As I may have said, some of the critical theorists don't like that, but I think that's fair. And then the question is, well, what's the utopia? If you get Marxism, if you get communism, if you get these isms, and you succeed in your program, then what's the utopia that you want? And I'm not sure. I'm not sure what that is. I'm not sure. I mean, we've certainly moved away. They've moved away from, Marx's workers' paradise. I don't know if it's just a destructive thing or if this is the point where this trans-humanist agenda comes in and they're imagining creating, recreating, generating their own, self-guided kind of heaven on earth.
It would be interesting to know if the original school, and I'm going to be doing a podcast as well with Phil Magnus about the Frankfurt School, where critical theory stems from, and I'd like to find out more about that. If those ideas were already there at that time, the idea that somehow through critical theory you were like becoming like a god, because I mean the transhumanist thing is pretty new, I believe. It's probably somewhere, I don't know, maybe in the last few decades. Do you know when that started? Because I wonder if how it got to that point.
Yeah. Yes, good question. I'm not sure, but on the other question, so I'm trying to see this through, as you know, I'm no theologian. I'm not a religious kind of person, but I can see the connections here. And a theologian might say this, and this is in response to the discussion we had about morality, right? So I'm partial to the proposition that morality is a subject that the individual has to decide, because otherwise the alternative is imposing one that he doesn't agree with. On the other hand, a theologian or a religious person might say, look, see what's happening. If we reject the idea of a virtuous morality, a morality learned from you know religious sources, and you insist upon there being no morality, then what did you expect to get? Now, I'm not endorsing that view. That's really not an individual autonomy kind of view. But I can see the argument, and the trends that are leading us down into a troublesome place.
Yes, it's kind of like moving towards hedonism in a way. And that is like if God, if the self, you're trying to attain God through the self, then that is kind of hedonistic as well. It's like the libertines versus the virtuous liberty kind of philosophy.
Sure. And the classical liberal in me doesn't have a problem with, if people want to be libertines. As far as I'm concerned, that's their business. I don't. So here's the dividing line
Hmm.
for me. And this is the way in which classical liberalism and transhumanism don't go together. You search for your own meaning, and whatever that means to you, you do. If that means you want to be hedonistic, well, okay, because it doesn't affect me. But when you start to change the world, if you start to seed clouds, or you start to transition children without their consent because they're too young to give you consent, or you start to change the world inevitably or irreversibly is a better word for the rest of us. Now you are interfering with the rest of us. Now you are not leaving us alone. If you want to be free to pursue your own secular kind of meaning, fine, no problem. Just do it on
Hmm.
your own and don't impose it upon the rest of us, which is what the critical theorists and the woke and the social justice warriors and the transhumanists are doing.
That's a very good point, Bruce. And I see this on Twitter all the time in these kind of little debates that people have, people who are, let's say, woke progressives who adhere to all of this kind of philosophy, and then people who might be more classical liberal or conservative or somewhere around there, uh, who might be opposed to what they're saying and what they're doing. Oftentimes, the woke progressives will say, it's none of your business. Like we're just being ourselves. We're just doing what we want. Like, why do you care so much? And in fact, I read a comment like that today, and somebody said something
Mm-hmm.
to that effect. They said, well, listen, I don't care what you do with your body. Like, it really doesn't bother me, but I do care what uh, your ideology is doing to children. Right. So that's a kind
Right.
of a line in
Right.
the sand. And how then, Bruce, does that, I mean, you said now it's starting to change the world. So now it's starting to affect me. But that's also, how do you draw that line in the sand? Because then that comes down to
Oh,
externalities too, right? Then
yeah.
you can say your example that you gave before of the person who's walking outside on the sidewalk and might have some kind of virus, well, they might be affecting you. So it's a tricky point to make.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely, no question about it. Because you're getting into the weeds now, into the fine detail, and the lines you're trying to draw are not big, obvious, bold ones. They're like, okay, so So in this situation, how does this work out? And what you've just done is really try to start to solve legal problems. This is the way it works, right? You start with a proposition, but then you say, well, how about this? Here's a problematic situation where the rule that you just expressed doesn't resolve this cleanly. So what does the rule mean in this situation? But there are some analogies that might be helpful. One of the analogies that I like are markets. So a market is a system, like an ecosystem is a system. And what other people do in markets affects other people, right? So if you want to go and you buy a pair of shoes, and you buy the shoes for $100, well, that's an input into the system. Those shoes have sold for $100. That's a piece of information that the seller of shoes takes on board, the buyer of shoes takes on board. I mean, maybe not directly, but it helps to establish, the supply and demand curve and so on. So it's not that your action is entirely independent of the rest of the world. It has an effect. Okay? That's what a market is. I mean, the market literally is a dynamic that results from a set of transactions. Like when we say market, we don't mean the farmer's market.
Yeah.
We mean the dynamic, right? So you can't have a rule that nothing you do can affect anything else. That doesn't make sense.
Right.
On the other hand, your purchase of those shoes is only an input in the same way that everybody else's choices are inputs. The market consists of a whole bunch of autonomous buyers and sellers making choices. And the market is the sum total of those choices. So here's the thing. Nobody controls the system. Nobody controls the system. They're all able to participate in it and make their own choices inside the system, but the system becomes whatever it becomes because of the combination of all those choices. Except if somebody comes along, like the government, and says, shoes will sell for a minimum of $120. Okay? Well, now you are imposing what is essentially monopoly power. You are dictating the outcome of what would otherwise be a voluntary transaction. Okay? Now, you could say the same thing about societies. As long as all the individuals are autonomous in making their own choices, societies change over time. I mean, the thinking changes, the traditions change, the interactions change. Fair enough, because the dynamic is the same as the market. Everybody is free, and what's happening is a result of all of those individual choices. But that's different from someone coming along and saying, folks, this is the way it's going to be. Why? Because I have the power, and I've decided that's better. That's not good.
That's a very, very good analogy. And I think that it ties in kind of maybe a last point here about critical theory, the administrative state, and how they intersect, which is that all of these ideas now are being pushed or supported by the administrative state. So you have that manipulation there. You don't have those free transactions of moral decisions, of social decisions, of whether to live a life of moral virtue or as a libertine or whatever it is. Like there's now these kind of programs are coming through the universities, a lot of them that are publicly funded. And then on top of that,
Yes.
they're coming back and being recycled back in through society. And then there are laws that are being built to establish them, I believe. That's what it looks like, and to
Yes.
protect them. And so that is manipulating and kind of making a box around individuals and allowing them less choices. And in that way, that is, you're talking about shaping the world around me, like don't affect the world around me. Well, that's maybe how it affects you if we think of that analogy, is that now you're in a smaller box.
Oh, sure. These are becoming coercive. And once you do that, then you are forcing the social change that you've decided, in your discretion that you want to see. That's not the same thing as the dynamic that we were talking about. It would be, listen, if if all of the autonomous individuals said, you know what, I think I believe in this, and they began to behave that way, okay, I mean, how can you object to that? Because they're making their own call voluntarily. All right. That's not what's happening in many, many situations. People are being herded
Yes.
into a particular point of view, and they're being threatened with, the end of their careers or their jobs or their futures or their education or their social standing, or as the case may be, if they don't go along. That is not the same dynamic at all.
So, okay. So, last thing, let's see here if we can find any solutions for our audience. I know you're going to love this question here because this is, it's a hard one. What are really any
Yeah.
kinds of easy solutions? It doesn't look like there are any easy solutions, but what do you think, Bruce, that individuals can do if they don't like what they see when it comes to how this critical theory stuff manifests itself in society?
There are strategies are difficult. They're not obvious, and they take some thinking through. But I think the first step probably is to decide whether you want to be a person who is open about your disagreement or whether you want to hide it. Because the strategic choices flow from that choice. If you're going to be obvious about it and transparent and object, then you're committed to that path. Because once you've done that, you've done it. And it'll be difficult to pretend as though you made a mistake and you want to go back in hiding. That's difficult to do. But I mean, it's a good choice. I mean, it's a choice that I've made, and there's rewards in it. You don't have to pretend. You can say what you think, and you should. That's the best way to live. Even if it's got risk in it, I think in the long run, it's probably the way to show integrity to yourself. On the other hand, there are also strategic choices open if you decide to stay underground. If you want to object in your own head, but not to be transparent about it, then you can, embed yourself in a situation, in an organization that where nobody understands what you really think, and how to proceed from there is tricky, right? Because if you embed yourself and then you spring a surprise on them, then okay, but that means you've spent all your capital on that surprise and then it's over. So the question is, how do you do that on an ongoing basis without giving yourself up? I don't know. I'm not in that situation, but the most important thing I think is that whichever way you go and whatever you decide to do, to be deliberate about it, like actually make some choices and don't let the thing just pass you by. Don't just go along because it's the safest thing to do. It's a terrible way to live.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's actually a great answer because you're saying here it's not actually what the consequences are of whatever you're going to do, which I know you don't really like consequentialist arguments for things, right? That the idea is, oh, well, you do this because you're going to get this outcome. The idea here is you do this for your own integrity. You make a choice of how to kind of navigate this kind of culture in a way that you can still have a good life and keep your conscience and your soul, if you will, intact.
Yes, I think that's a good way to put
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Okay, well, listen, we've covered a lot. We've jumped a little around, and I think that this was a great conversation. I will definitely direct people to go and read your chapter in this book if they get the book, The 1867 Project, Why Canada Should Be Cherished, Not Cancelled. And if not, they can read a short excerpt from that in the National Post, which I'll link below in this conversation, in this podcast description.
Also in the
Oh,
Epoch
is it in
Times.
the Epoch
Same
Times as
excerpt.
well? Okay, great. Well,
Yes.
any last thoughts, Bruce?
No, I think we covered the ground pretty well. Thanks,
Okay.
Kate. It's always great to
Thank you
talk to you.
so much. Have a great evening.